this episode, we're going to talk about the wise and the foolish. Here we go. So in this episode, as we go through the letter to the Corinthians, the epistle to the Corinthians, much of the theme here that we're covering is something that we've been covering from the very beginning, which is the higher and the lower laws. And he compares this in several different ways that you're going to identify. And you're going to see this, we've seen this in Acts with Paul. We've seen this in the epistle to the Romans we just went over. We see it throughout all of the epistles of Paul, where we get the higher and the lower laws working sometimes together, but usually it's the conflict that we have. It's the carnal side, which tries to go and be more important, more valuable, higher in the values hierarchy, and the higher law being lowered. And what Paul is trying to do is trying to reverse that. He's trying to put the spiritual above the carnal. And again, there are a lot of things that are compared to the carnal. There are temporal things. There are checklists, the letter of the law, money, and a physical, temporal economy as compared to a spiritual economy. And what Paul is trying to say here is that, look, a lot of these things are weak. You know, how we've gone over weaknesses in the letter of the epistle to the Romans. He continues that theme here and talks about weakness actually being a strength. Weakness in terms of a mortal weakness. That is, being here on earth with weaknesses that might hold you back sometimes from being mightier or being in royalty or being part of the court and the inner circle in civilization. So weakness could be something where you're poor. Weakness can be health issues. Weakness can be that you're an outsider. You're an outcast, perhaps. Paul is trying to gather this and say, look, these are strengths because you're more open to the spiritual law, to the higher law. Going through 1 Corinthians reminds me a lot about Alma teaching the poor that were outcast among the Zoramites. Remember, when they're in their synagogues, in their churches, they are very grandiose in how grateful they are for everything that they have and the position in life where they've been elevated in a mortal world in a carnal sense. And yet here are the people outside that are outcast because of their poverty or their weakness are the ones that Alma ends up going to. And he's actually grateful that they're in that position because they're going to be more open to receiving the gospel. And so that weakness actually becomes a strength. Of course, in the Book of Mormon, as with all of us, it's a point of, are we able to stay that way? Are we able to stay humble even as we grow in the principles of the gospel and better ourselves? That's the key, the conflict. Can you keep both things going? So his first point to them really is about divisions, about how, of course, you've got the Jews on one side, you've got the Greeks on the other, the Gentiles, and then other divisions among them where they are kind of following different ideas or they all have different values hierarchies. What is more important to them? Is it about the resurrection? Is it about the crucifixion? Is it the teachings of Peter? Is it the teachings of Paul? Is it the teachings of Apollos? And so inevitably, this is what always happens in all organizations, you end up with divisions. Things start to break apart. And so this is what he says in verse 10. Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. Remember how we've talked about being in the same mind and the same heart. It's very different from being different from each other. There's an article out on LDS.org right now from Elder Soares that talks about this exact thing. It's a lot like the Rubik's Cube that we've talked about. We're all different. That's okay. We need to blend together and make each other strong with those differences. But that's not what's happening here at Corinth. And of course, Paul's letters are constantly trying to keep everything together, which is a very difficult thing. No social media, no internet, no phones, no easy communication. Even for the leaders of the church at this time, think about that. They're out. Peter's out here, Paul's out here, Apollos is out here. You're all over the place. And you're coming across these new issues within the church. How difficult is it to stay on the same page? We saw the conflict in the book of Acts where the issue of circumcision just became a huge problem and divided people for a while. How do you go out in an evangelical preaching missionary effort to different cities, different countries, different civilizations, and try and keep everything together on the same page? Sometimes I think that might be the only reason that the gospel in the last days here is going to be able to make it. Because as each dispensation moves along, the divisions come, it breaks apart, and it just cannot be held together. And of course, there's sin that is a big part of that, but I think that communication might be a big issue with that too. Maybe it's technology that actually does end up saving the church in the end, where we are able to feel the support and the brotherhood and sisterhood of the entire global church because of technology. So Paul says, look, I understand that there's been contentions among you. And he says down here in verse 12, now this I say, that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, and I of Apollos, and I of Cephas, which is Peter, and I of Christ. And then he asks, is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Of course, it's very easy when you have a person that you're learning from to elevate them too much. That's a problem. You can see the cult of personality. A lot of churches are built off of this cult of personality. Especially cults are built off of a cult of personality. Totalitarian regimes are built off of a cult of personality. They have to be elevated to make things kind of work in those civilizations. And it's easier for us to do that because we see them, we talk to them, we hear them. But Paul here will have none of it. And he's saying, no, we need to keep Christ at the top of the values hierarchy at all times. Again, this goes right toward the Nehor principle. Even things like this, where individuals get elevated too high, like Moses for the Jews. Christ has to always be at the top of our values hierarchy. And then he goes into this weakness and strengths here. The weakness of the individuals he's speaking to and of really the path, in a sense, of accepting the gospel versus those that will not easily accept the gospel. So for the Jews, as an example, he says that they want a sign, and it becomes a stumbling block for them. They don't have the faith. They are focused on the letter of the law. And of course, the major sign that Paul and everyone else is preaching about in Christianity is the sacrifice of Christ in Gethsemane, his death, and then his resurrection. So the Jews want something more. They want to see something about this. They want to put the sign in front of faith. That's the problem that they're having. It's very similar to the Antichrist, those that are called Antichrist in the Book of Mormon. For example, Korihor. Korihor wanted a sign. Now, Korihor was an atheist, and so he didn't have any faith in anything. But Sherem, that comes to Jacob, Sherem was a believer in the lower law, but not in the higher law. He did not believe in Christ. And he was the same way. He required a sign before faith. And of course, that goes against everything in the plan of salvation. It goes against everything in our personal progression. if we can't learn to trust in something that's true, and lean on a principle, then we cannot progress. And he's saying that's where the Jews are right now at this time, that they're trying to preach to. And on the other side, you have the Greeks. And their issue is they don't think that this is wise, right? They're too sophisticated. They look at this as foolishness because in their schools of philosophy, they have developed their thought processes up to a certain point, and these things don't jive together. The gospel is too simple. And so in their own way, they are missing the mark, right? They're going beyond the mark as well, mentally. So he says here in verse 23, "But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness." So it's kind of like giving us those two areas, like, okay, you're not willing to trust, you're not willing to put faith to try and learn and grow and progress, and or you think you're too sophisticated for this. Those are the two obstacles. Those are the two sides in this case of kind of the duplex of the great and spacious building at this time among the Christians. It's the shame that's coming from them, from that building, that of course is elevated. And that's the whole point, right? That's what Lehi is seeing in that vision. He's seeing the world that is mighty and elevated and strong, while those that are weak, so to speak, as Paul is speaking here, going to the tree of life. And of course, many fall away from that because of a stumbling block that is taught to them to not count on their faith, or it's foolishness. And you should be ashamed. And he says this very interestingly. He says in verse 26, "For ye see your calling, brethren, how that not many wise men after the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called." And how true is that? Right? Those that are strong in the sense of this world. We're all individuals. We all have our own agency. We can all make our own decisions. So we don't want to just classify everybody. But generally speaking, it's the poor, it's those that are in a weakened position that look more for God and that believe more, especially, I think, in Christianity. It's those that are willing to have faith. And we find that over and over again in the scriptures, just like with the Zoramites. It's not always the case, but overall, with a large enough number, a large enough sample size, that's what we see. We see the same thing in the world right now. Where do we see the fastest growth in the church? It's not in these civilizations that have advanced really far, that are mighty in the world. The fastest growing areas are, I believe, are the Philippines, Latin America, and Africa. A few other pockets here and there, right? Third world countries. Places where there is not a lot that are strong according to this world. Then he says in verse 27, "But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty." We think about the plain and simple things that Nephi talks about. Or how about a 14-year-old farm boy from upstate New York? And in fact, we almost see this as a calling card with a lot of the prophets and a lot of the principles that the prophets and apostles talk about. We hear about Moses not being able to speak well. I often wonder about that, if that's really true, or if that's just kind of a thing that needs to be pointed out, that he's weak. And in a sense, that's a calling card to those that are listening that understand this kind of thing, that makes him strong. Or Nephi in his famous psalm in the Book of Mormon, talking about how he is weak. Anyway, it just seems to be a common thing that we get with a number of the prophets and the apostles here in the scriptures. And here in chapter 2, this is almost how, this is how Paul opens up. Down here in verse 3, he says, "And I was with you in weakness." He is claiming this, see? He wants people to know that as he's talking about this weakness, that he is part of that he's among that weakness. In a sense, it's kind of like saying that he is humble. and that he has problems, and therefore he has something higher that he has to call upon. He says, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And then he says this, and this is important for the Greeks that are there, with all of the rhetoric and the philosophy and logic that they learn to argue with in their points. You imagine Paul coming to some of these Greeks, going to Athens and talking to these individuals that are trained to talk in a certain way and to win an argument. And here's what he says. He says, and my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom. That's exactly what he's talking about. But in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. And why does he do that? Because in verse 5 he says that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. That's pretty powerful, right? He's not trying to win an argument. That is oftentimes how we might discuss something, especially like religion. He's trying to teach with the Spirit. He's trying to convert. So your faith, he says, should not stand in the wisdom of men. So I think we should be careful about who we listen to and what narratives that are being put out there in any realm that we might think are wise, and contrast that with the Spirit. And in verse 7 he says, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery. It's a great word. Look for that word throughout the Scriptures. It's almost always tied to the temple. And specifically, it's usually tied to the Holy of Holies. I can't remember if I've talked about that before, but I'll take just a minute here to talk about that. He says, but we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory. So it was ordained before the world. Well, where is the beginning? What do we talk about with the beginning? It's the sod in Hebrew. It's the council in heaven, in the pre-existence. That's part of what the Holy of Holies represents. That's where the mysteries were given in this council. And so as you read things like Job, Nephi, and many, many other places, and you see the term mysteries, oftentimes what you're talking about, not directly, but very closely attached to the temple. Because the temple is all about those mysteries back in the Holy of Holies that were given in the council in heaven. They're mysteries because they're veiled behind the veil in the Holy of Holies. So the Greeks would understand this very well, because in their temples, they used the term mysterion, and that meant the mysteries of their own temples. They know kind of what that means. That could include the ordinances, the covenants, and all those things that go along with what was revealed in that council. And then back down to the higher and the lower laws. All this weakness of earthly weakness and spiritual weakness, and earthly strength and spiritual strength. It's all about kind of this higher and lower law, the spiritual and the carnal. And he finishes up with this. We hear this term in the Book of Mormon as well. He says, but the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness unto him, just like the Greeks are saying. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. So the natural man, what is the natural man? The natural man is us without the Spirit. It's the carnal. And we use that term carnal, and a lot of times we think of primarily lust, which is probably the major passion or carnal passion. But carnal really represents everything in the lower law, everything earthly. And that's what the natural man is, of nature, of earthly nature. And if we are residing mentally, emotionally, spiritually, down in a lower law, down in the natural man only, then we can't discern the spiritual things. We can't discern the mysteries. We can't really discern the plan and the counsel that was given to us in the pre-existence, and all of the principles that were laid out for us, including agency and sin and the fall and the atonement. And then in chapter 3, he brings us right back again to higher and lower. He uses a different metaphor here, but it's higher and lower. And we've heard this metaphor many times other places. It says in verse 1, "And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ." So in other words, as if you don't have a full understanding yet of the mysteries. You don't have a full understanding of the gospel. Because obviously we don't throw pearls before swine, as we're told in the Gospels. That's inappropriate. And it's wrong for the listener to receive too much too fast that they can't absorb yet. They're not in a position yet to understand or to accept the responsibility that goes along with that information. And so he says in verse 2, "I have fed you with milk and not with meat." So milk is the lower law, meat would be the higher law in this case. "For hitherto ye were not able to bear it, neither yet now are ye able." Again, going back with Paul and with all of the scriptures, but Paul really goes into this a lot. It's Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, that's where the mysteries are given. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, the higher and the lower laws. There has to be both. So it's what's given to us immediately. And that was part of the principle in the beginning, in the council, in the preexistence. And in verse 3 here, he follows up and says, "For ye are yet carnal. For whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men?" So these are all things that would be results of behavior of a lower law. And then Paul gives us example that we see many times throughout the scriptures. We see it in the parables, in the Gospels. We see it in Alma 32, where there is a seed that is planted and then it's cultivated and watered and builds from there. And he talks about how he has come and put the seed in place in many places. And then Apollos, you remember from the book of Acts, the one that was from Alexandria, Egypt, he would come in, and Paul says that he would then water what Paul had planted. But he says, look, these are not the Lord. These are not the ones that are to be venerated. Not the planter and not the waterer. Or in the parables, it might be those that are in the vineyard. There is a Lord of the vineyard. And so he says in verse 8, "Now he that planteth and he that watereth are one." In other words, they should be, again, like one mind. They're the same purpose. "And every man shall receive his own reward according to his own labor." That, by the way, goes to works. Works is definitely a part of the equation here. "For we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry. Ye are God's building." So again, Paul brings in temple, which is what he's really going to be doing here throughout the epistles. Temple, which is the building, and the church, and our bodies. He does this often. He says, "According to the grace of God which is given unto me, as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another buildeth thereon. But let every man take heed how he buildeth thereupon. For other foundation can no man lay than this is laid, which is Jesus Christ." Again, the Nihor principle. It has to be Christ all the way down, so to speak, as Stephen Hawking, well, probably wouldn't have said. But it's Jesus Christ all the way down. And then in verse 16, he brings this body and church and temple together. He says, "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God?" So this is the context of this verse. It's always important to understand what the context is. He's talking about the church. In this instance, it's not just our bodies. He's talking about the foundation that's being built on Christ and this building that is being created. He's talking about the church. "Know ye not that ye are the temple of God?" That's the church members. "And that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you," or among you. "If any man defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. For the temple of God is holy, which temple ye are." Sometimes we use that with an example of the word of wisdom or our bodies, and it does apply to that. But there's plenty of other scriptures that directly apply to that. This here is talking about the building of the church. Not that you can't take it one step over and say, well, this is you individually also. You can. But the context here is talking about the church. And then he goes back to being wise and being foolish. And he makes the recommendation here that you be foolish, at least in the way that he's talking about it. What does he say? He says, let no man deceive himself. If any man among you seemeth to be wise in this world. So he's talking about wise in a worldly sense. Let him become a fool, that he may be wise, or really wise, truly wise. Think about that. That is a really hard thing. It is so hard because of pride to break down knowledge and wisdom of the world that we gain, to put ourselves in a vulnerable position that seems lowered. I mean, are you going to lower yourself? Here as you build up your knowledge, especially think about the academy, think about academics. Why is there such an opposition to theology in academics? More than we might find in other places. I think that's a pretty simple answer, right? Because of the wisdom of the world that is built up there. A lot of it is wonderful stuff, but it also puts individuals in a position where it's hard to be, as Paul would say here, a fool, and put yourself in that type of a vulnerable position. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. For it is written, he taketh the wise in their own craftiness. And the Lord knoweth the thoughts of the wise, that they are vain, so they have no purpose. Therefore let no man glory in men, for all things are yours. And whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas, that's Peter, or the world, or life, or death, or things present, or things to come, all are yours. In other words, you are an individual, and this is all for your benefit. They all come to you. Don't lift the wrong people up, because as he finishes off here in verse 23, and ye are Christ's, and Christ is God's. So there is our hierarchy, our fluid hierarchy. Fluid not because they move, but fluid because we can move with them. I'll talk to you next time.